Brown. I'm the contributing editor for Petal Love, and I'm here with Melissa Balmer, who is Petal Love's founder and creator. Today, we're going to be expanding on what we covered in our December workshop. We'll hear from one of the people whose story we've already gathered for the SLOCOG Active Transportation Plan, and we'll talk about storytelling as an advocacy strategy with a particular focus on how stories are told. First, I want to go over some quick housekeeping. If you're not already muted, please mute yourself, and that way everybody can hear the presentation. If you have them, you might want to put on a headset or headphones for the best audio. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. If you have a question in the meantime during the presentation, write it down using the chat box that's at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll get to it during the Q&A. We'll take them questions in turn. And as you think about your questions, think about how Melissa and I can help you unpack your specific storytelling question or need. So Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Fantastic. Okay, so you're gonna stop screen sharing and I'm gonna start screen sharing.
Right.
Okay. So, hey everybody, hold on just a second here. Okay, fantastic. I'm just test something real quick to make sure. Yep, we got it. Okay, so I'm going to start us off today by doing a little bit of a review of what we did last time and talk about why storytelling is your superpower. So my goal with this section is to help you get closer to crafting stories that your audience will find compelling, memorable, and satisfying. Stories that will be valuable in helping you create measurable impact. And don't worry, everything that Jim and I share with you today will be shared in a PDF toolkit and also in the recording. And we will get that to you by the very beginning of next week, if not earlier. We know that in your work, your story might not be the one that's best told in many situations. However, it does have value and it will have a place to be told. And knowing how to tell your own story is really going to help you engage others in telling their story. Becoming an appealing storyteller isn't something that happens overnight. This is an ongoing process. But if you take on this role, I believe you'll discover how valuable and enjoyable it will be for any type of communications that you want to do. So as humans, we crave something very wonky called narrative transportation. And this simply means that we like to get lost in a story. We like to be so caught up in it that we lose track of time. And most of us can remember, in fact, maybe all of us, before the pandemic, going to a movie theater to see a movie in the bright sunny afternoon and coming out in confusion and blinking at the total darkness. It seemed like only 10 minutes because we were so caught up in the movie, but actually it was more than 2 hours. So as someone who wants to effectively share your passion and commitment to active transportation and SLO, we want you to learn how to evoke narrative transportation. And it's a very smart goal on social media, traditional media, or live. And I think we have somebody who needs to mute themselves because we're hearing a bunch of stuff. So let's go over a little bit about storytelling as a superpower from science point of view. Over the past 15 years or so, scientists have actually been able to track and discover exactly why stories are so compelling to us. Here are the key reasons that I shared with you last time. I want to go over them again. Our brains are wired for story. It's how we make meaning of the world. Start paying attention to your own inner dialogue about just about anything. You'll recognize that you're telling yourself a story about the information that you're taking in. In fact, you're probably telling yourself a story right now about what I'm sharing with you. When you're listening to, reading, or watching a story, the part of the brain activates that allows you to place yourself in the story. This is why so many people are crazy for the Force in the Star Wars movies. This is called neural coupling. The next reason is that when we're listening to, reading, or watching a story, the same parts of the brain activate in the others who are also reading or watching the story, and to the storyteller themselves. So we're all having very similar brain activity today when I go into the storytelling part of it and when Audrey tells her story a little bit later. This term is called mirroring, and it's important because it helps us know that storytelling breeds compassion, and it helps create empathy by letting us see the world from very different perspectives. And it can inspire very positive action. The flip side of this, though, as we've seen lately, is that stories can stir up and build hate and negative action. So it's all in how you use them. The human brain can't remember just data, statistics, facts that are shared very well at all. However, it can remember stories. Reading, listening to, or watching a story activates more parts of the brain than if you're receiving just simple information. And the brain, when you're listening to or engaged with a story, releases the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine makes it even easier for things to be remembered. So think back on one of your favorite stories, a movie or a book from childhood, and even if it was 50 years ago, I would bet that you could tell me the full plot line today if I asked you. So as I shared with you last time, stories need to have structure. They have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or they're not stories. And we shared with you this structure for stories called a narrative arc. And this shape of a successful story was discovered in the 19th century by a playwright and writer named Gustav Freytag, who did research and realized that the stories that really withstand the test of time and are still popular, such as Shakespeare's plays, follow this particular shape. It has 5 distinctive steps or acts. This shape is often called Freytag's pyramid, but it's also just called a story arc or a narrative arc. And in our first workshop, I shared with you about what we call a simplified hero's journey as the best type of story to tell for active transportation. A simplified hero's journey uses this structure, but then it adds a few little extras that I'll share with you in just a moment. So the 5 steps are that number 1, you have an exposition or beginning that sets off the scene and describes a happy normal that's just about to get upended, or a terrible normal where there's finally a straw that breaks the camel's back. Then you have the rising action. This is the inciting incident where your hero starts to go on a journey of transformation. And for many of you, it might be something dangerous, like maybe you almost got hit by, or you actually got hit by a car. This is the hook to catch your audience's attention. This is where your drama really begins. Third, you have the climax, which is the story's height of the action and the turning point. And this, for a hero's journey, is where you have an aha moment where you start to see the world anew, and you learn a lesson that you can then share with others. And I'm going to go more deeply into this in just a moment. Fourth, you have the falling action. And this is when, and you know in stories that there's one or more twists in the road that keeps the hero from their final destination. And sometimes surprising help arrives to help you get to move things forward. And then finally, you have a resolution. And this is where you wrap the story up for now. In The Wizard of Oz, this is where Dorothy and Toto make it home. That's in the movie. And for most of us, that's the end of the story. But the Wizard of Oz book was just one in a series of many books. So Dorothy went on to many more adventures, just like we go on for active mobility. So now let's go into new territory and 4 secret ingredients that will really help make your story more compelling, more satisfying, and more memorable. You remember how I talked just a moment ago about the climax being a place where a hero's journey can have an aha moment where you see the world anew and you learn a lesson that you then are willing to share with other people. One of the personal hero's journey stories that I share is about becoming car-free because my car was impounded for parking tickets in March of 2007, and I literally could not afford to pay them. So I decided to let my car go to the impoundment yard. And the truth was that I had wanted to donate my car the previous holiday season, but I just lost my nerve. We were experiencing a heat wave in Long Beach when I went to go pick my belongings up out of the trunk of my car by bus. I lived just 2 blocks from the beach, but it was already over 90 degrees in March. I was already sweating by the time I got to the bus stop. And getting on the bus to go to the impoundment yard across the city felt like, at that time for me, a walk of shame. I have to admit it. But it was delightfully cool on the air conditioned bus. I had to make 2 trips to the impoundment yard to get everything out of my car. But I had a big aha moment while I was making those trips. I realized it really had been a burden to own an aging car that was breaking down all the time while I was struggling with chronic health conditions and only working part-time freelance. Plus, I lived in a very parking impacted historic neighborhood. And now I realized, wow, I can travel very inexpensively and pretty conveniently in Long Beach because we had a great bus system. It really was an aha moment. And I could travel and read at the same time, which for me was a really great big win. I couldn't wait to share with people what happened to me about this experience. And it led 2 years later to my becoming an active mobility advocate. The second thing is you don't want to make your story too spicy or too sweet. So think of yourself as a chef of your story. Scientist Paul Zak and his team of researchers discovered that stories that follow that narrative arc that I shared with you previously release powerful chemicals in the brain of people who are taking in the story. And this makes it, again, more compelling, more satisfying, and more memorable. When you have an inciting incident just after the beginning of your story, something challenging that sets you off on a journey, it releases the stress hormone cortisol in your audience, which really engages the attention span. Then, when you have a big aha moment and you see the world anew and you overcome big obstacles, in the climax, it releases the feel-good hormone oxytocin. And finally, in the resolution, when things wrap up with a bow for now, the brain releases the neurotransmitter dopamine, which we encountered before, and that gives you a positive feeling of accomplishment, or your audience, and of course, they remember it much better. If you focus too much attention on any one aspect of this story, it'll be an unbalanced triangle, or think of it as a 3-legged stool. So you focus on too much area and it'll be wobbly and it won't be so interesting to your audience. If you focus too much on the challenges, people will feel turned off by you playing the victim. Sadly, even if you really were a victim. Focus too much on your success and people will feel you're bragging. They really want to hear that struggle and overcoming. And if you don't wrap things up with a resolution at the end, people will feel unsatisfied because they'll feel like they were left hanging. So obviously, no, real life doesn't work exactly like stories do. That's why you have to shape your stories. And I'm not suggesting you lie, not at all, but I am absolutely recommending that you listen to the science to shape your stories, again, to make them more interesting, satisfying, and memorable for your audience. And the fourth and final thing that I want to share with you today is to tune in to one sense memory. And this idea is from the acclaimed lecturer and award-winning producer, Babette Bruster, in her book, Do Stories. She recommends that you share with the audience a description from one of your memories in order to captivate them. So close your eyes for a minute and think of your own hero's journey story, or any story that you like to tell regularly. What did you hear? What did you smell, taste, feel in your body when it was happening? Was it hot, cold, sunny, windy? Were your teeth chattering, or were you sweating like I was in 90-degree heat? Was someone blasting music nearby, cooking something delicious you could smell? Could you hear the ocean or the wind in the trees? In my own story of giving up my car, I tuned in and shared the sense memory of how very uncomfortably hot I was walking from my apartment to the bus stop. The heat itself is almost a character in my story, and it helps the readers and listeners be in the moment with me. Who hasn't had an uncomfortably hot experience before? So As you get ready for the weekend and you think about who you're going to be talking to and stories you might be telling them, think about sharing a sense memory with them when you tell a story and see what happens. I bet you will find that they're much more engaged. And then finally, we want to use descriptive language in our story. So go over your story and look for places where you can use more interesting language. Choose words that bring color and flavor and texture to your story. This doesn't necessarily mean using big, long, complicated words, especially if you're going to be telling it like I am right now. And it certainly doesn't mean to use words just to make yourself sound smart. No, what you're looking for is words that bring emotional punch and resonance. So in my own story, I made sure to share with you that it was over 90 degrees outside in March, just 2 blocks from the beach. I could have just told you it was hot, but that wouldn't put you in the place with me feeling what I was feeling. By my telling you that it was over 90 degrees, you really got an idea of just how hot it was. So now what we're going to do, I'm going to stop sharing mine here and see, and we're going to, oops, excuse me for just a second. Let's see, I'm going to take us out of the story and get back into where I need to get with you all. There. Now, did my story disappear for everybody? Oh, here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring Audrey forward. Audrey, where are you? And
hello.
Okay. And I'm going to mute myself and let Audrey tell her story.
Cool. I should just go for it.
I think, well, let me give you a little bit of a, I'm sorry, I just threw you to the wind there and I didn't want to do that. How about if I do this? How about if I introduce you? I've got a note here. So Audrey is one of our storytellers that we have as part of the SLOCOG Active Transportation Plan. And we recruited her to be one of the live storytellers today to kind of give you an example of more. She's going to go more in depth than the little bits of story that I shared with you. Audrey is formerly from the Bike Kitchen in SLO, in downtown SLO. And she recently joined one of the bike industry's top companies internationally, SRAM, which is also there with you in San Luis Obispo. So how about that, Audrey? I will turn that over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. I remember the sound of air whizzing out of my tire, the sun beating down on my neck. Good thing I was only a block from home. It was 2015 and I had just bought this bike a few months ago so that I could start commuting to work, and I knew that this would be happening soon. My tire was wearing down to the threads and I wasn't ready to commit to changing these tires out, but now I had no choice. I struggled for an hour with the first tire and tube. I got them on and they held air, but I knew there was an easier way. I had heard about the Bike Kitchen before, a DIY bike shop with people that teach you to work on your bike. My first experience at the kitchen was amazing. I got the help that I needed, but I also left feeling incredibly empowered because the volunteer helping me recognized my natural mechanical skills and technical inclination. He encouraged me to start volunteering so that I could help others learn and also learn more about bikes for myself. I started volunteering in my free time and quickly fell in love with the experience. The staff soon recognized my skills and dedication, and just a few weeks into volunteering, I was asked to take the lead of the women's program, where I got to operate special hours specifically for women, trans, and femme folk. Not only did I continue growing my skills, but I was able to grow community and empower women to pick up tools and learn how to work on their own bikes. A few months into that, I was recruited to become the first female mechanic for Eroica, which is an international bike organization that hosts vintage bike rides all over the world. We happen to have an annual ride in Paso/Cambria, which is a testament to the beautiful Tuscana scenery in our county. To be the first female anything is an honor, but also an unfortunate shock that we still have those opportunities today. I assembled a small team of female mechanics to assist me at the event. Wrenching on vintage bikes is something that I'm passionate and knowledgeable about, but that didn't matter to the average rider at Eroica. Many of the men who needed bike repairs would look over our shoulders or just grab the tools from our hands, insisting that they could do it themselves. This constant burning annoyance of sexism persisted in my career at the Bike Kitchen. Even when I was working full-time at the shop, I would regularly have customers and community members question my skills. I had to patiently work to prove my worth and knowledge rather than being trusted outright. But I persisted. I organized and led WTF and LGBTQ bike rides and community events because I wanted to spread the joy I felt about bikes to the under-recognized communities in our area. I continued to grow the women's program and work for Eroica, and every year we had more and more riders start to trust our knowledge. They went from watching our every move to leaving their bike with us and disappearing for 30 minutes to get a snack. Eroica even recognized our worth and novelty and started to place us at the most important rest stop on the route. Our diligence and precision with vintage bikes made us fan favorites eventually. Despite the self-doubt that arose from constantly being questioned, I was able to transform the bike kitchen into a safe space where anyone could come and ask for help with their bike. I wasn't doing this for myself. I was doing it to create a more inclusive environment and to lift people up the way that I had been lifted up by that first encounter with the bike kitchen. Customers were happy and we were selling more bikes than ever. Yet still, I started suffering from the classic advocacy burnout. 3 years into my career at the bike kitchen, a mentor approached me about my future. She suggested that I apply for an opening at SRAM. I didn't think I was qualified and worried that I would be overlooked because of my gender. After much contemplation, I realized that I was ready for change. The kitchen couldn't support me for the rest of my life, and I had grown beyond what the kitchen could offer, so I applied for the job. After a complex and lengthy interview process, I got the job. Not only was I qualified, but I was selected from dozens of male applicants as the best fit for the position. A few weeks after joining the team at SRAM, I joined the diversity committee so that I can continue my efforts to actively look for ways to help support women and BIPOC getting involved with the world of bikes. Fortunately, all of this effort means that I have proven my worth and knowledge and seldom feel that I'm a woman in a man's world at SRAM. Thank you.
Audrey, thank you so much for sharing that story. I hope you all noticed how Audrey's story demonstrated the ways in which a story holds our attention, what it was about Audrey's story that grabbed us. It demonstrates what Melissa was talking about the hero's journey story arc, as well as the features of a story that engage and motivate the listener. So I want to kind of shift the focus to what do we mean by engaging and motivating? What are we doing this for? Having a clear focus on the goal, on your underlying goal, the goal of your advocacy is what's going to help you find the right stories and the most effective ways to tell them. First, what is your goal? What do you specifically want to achieve? You want to be able to define this goal as narrowly as possible for yourself. This could be getting a crosswalk installed or an off-street bike path built. Again, that's going to determine who your audience is and what stories you tell. Second, who is the key person or group with the power to help you achieve your goal? This is your key audience. This is your main audience for your stories. These are the people you want to engage and motivate. What do you know about them? Are they a business owner? Are they a parent of school-age kids? What do they care about and who do they typically listen to? Just as important, who can they not afford to ignore? Knowing all this leads us to the next point, which is what are the stories that will most directly engage this audience that you've just identified? What you know about your audience kind of answers this question, doesn't it? These are most likely the stories of the people your audience listens to and can't afford to ignore. Finally, what is the best method for delivering these stories so that your audience will do what you need them to do? If you need a majority of the city council to approve the allocation of funds for a new traffic signal, you want to focus on the best methods for reaching and influencing that majority. What I'm describing here is your strategic plan for using stories to achieve your goals. I recommend this 4-step thought process for each part of your project. Your project or campaign may have multiple goals, and there's an audience for each of those goals and stories for each of those audiences. There isn't likely going to be just one story that serves all of your purposes. So what do we mean by telling? I want to spend the next few minutes talking about this last step, the method step, because I sense that this is the confusing part for a lot of people. When we talk about storytelling, it's easy to envision somebody standing up in front of a podium or on camera talking to a group of people, but there are actually many ways to tell a story. A story can be told verbally in front of a group or in a one-on-one meeting, via Zoom, on the phone, in a video or audio recording, such as Instagram Live, or on YouTube, or in a television or radio news interview. A story can also be told in writing, in an email, in a printed handout, on a website, or in a blog post, on social media, or in quotes that you give to a news story, or even a commentary that you might write for the local newspaper or a local news site. All of these methods are valuable, and you should be thinking about using some or all of them. So there isn't just one method that's going to be the most effective for your goal. But think about reaching your particular audience. For example, if you want to get that majority of the city council to allocate the funds for the new signal, you want to share your stories directly with each council member ahead of time, either in a one-on-one meeting or a phone call, and also by email. And then you want to touch on these stories in your verbal testimony to the city, before the city council. My point here is that is to focus your stories directly on the people with the power to help you accomplish your goal. Your city council member might see a Facebook post about your story, but they'll definitely hear your story if you send it to them directly and tell it to them in real time. Remember who precisely you're trying to reach and why. We focused on how to tell your own story to help, in part to help you understand what a story is and how it works. In a perfect world, everyone has the chance to tell their own story, but that's not always practical. So in addition to telling your own story, you may be taking the lead on a project or a campaign on behalf of a lot of other people whose stories are as valuable as your own story, and possibly even more valuable. So you may want to think about using stories, looking for as many relevant stories as you can. Having and sharing multiple stories simply helps communicate the broad importance of your needs, such as the installation of that traffic signal. And as you talk to people about your stories, pay attention to who might be interested in telling their own story. You can be a bit of a talent scout. You may be in a position to share with them what you've learned about creating and telling effective stories. And you definitely want to keep those people looped in for those occasions when you need people to show up and share stories. So for example, if you get invited to speak to a group or you get called to do a media interview, having a short list of people with really good stories can benefit your audience. It can benefit the reporter who's covering this story. So you want multiple stories. Of course, not everyone with a story is willing or able to stand up and tell it. And in that case, you might have them write it down for you. Or if necessary, have them tell it to you and you can write these stories down yourself. This is partly what we did in gathering some of the stories for the SLOCOG Active Transportation Plan. That's a perfectly valuable way to gather stories that you're going to need. When you find yourself in a situation where it's most valuable to tell someone else's story, you want to do so respectfully and accurately. As best you can, fully convey the person's feelings and direct experience. give the story full credit for her observations, insights, and conclusions. But this situation doesn't necessarily mean that you have to leave yourself out. In this instance where you're sharing someone else's story, you could include your experience of hearing them tell it. For example, talk about how it felt to hear her story, or how you've had a similar experience to hers, or how you've heard dozens of stories like hers, or how you can't possibly imagine what it was like for her. This is one way you can build a direct connection with the person who is listening to you. The main takeaway here is that stories have a strategic purpose. Be strategic about which ones you choose to tell and how to tell them. Stories are inherently engaging and persuasive. That's what makes them such a valuable tool in your advocacy toolkit. As Melissa said, storytelling really is your superpower. And with that, we're going to switch over to some questions. It looks like we've got plenty of time for questions. What we'll ask you to do is, I'm going to turn off screen sharing so I can see more features here. And so take a minute to write down your question in the chat window. I will be looking for questions and we'll be taking them in turn. I also want to start here with a question that our friend Meg posed to us a couple of days ago. She asks, say you've created your story and have been successful in gaining interest from your audience, but more steps need to be taken to move the process forward, and it requires a different audience. Where do you take your story from there? How do you determine who your next audience should be? What is the best strategy for running into roadblocks? Do you modify your story? I'm going to start with answering that, and then Melissa will jump in as well. Meg, this is really kind of the heart of what we're talking about here, is how do you find the stories that are most effective? And I would say you want to go back to your goal. So let's say that you've had the meeting with the county supervisor and that went well, but now you need to talk to the public works director. Again, what do you want the public works director to do? What's your ask for him? Do you want him to support your project? Do you want him to agree to communicate with the city council? Think about what you want him to do. Also think about what he's in the position to actually do for you. So you want to know what his role in this process is, and you want to know what he can actually do. So you know what your goal is, you know that he's your audience. Also, you want to know what he cares about. You know, the public works director may be most concerned about business owners, or might most be concerned about traffic circulation. So you want to do a little bit of homework to kind of figure out who you're working with here. And if, for example, it turns out that this person is particularly focused on the business community, then you might think about whether your story has a, or whether your proposal, for example, has a benefit for the business community. Even better, talk to a business owner who really supports your idea, and carry that story to the public works director. You might even introduce the business owner to the public works director and let that person talk directly. I think the point I'm making here is that you're kind of a facilitator in terms of figuring out who you're dealing with and who that person needs to hear from in order to be persuasive. So you want to be flexible about that. And as far as your own story is concerned, there's the long version of your story and there's the short version of your story. There's the 30-second elevator pitch. When I was at Calbike, I was the communications director, and I did a lot of the communications over at the state capitol on behalf of legislation. You might have 30 seconds to give somebody the gist of why you're there and what you need them to do. But you might also have 15 minutes to sit down and talk to them. So, you know, that's where kind of knowing what your full story is and then knowing what the key takeaways are going to be really helpful. So there, and then of course there's also the way that you kind of spin your story depending on who you're talking to. What you say to the public works director might be very different from what you say to your neighbor. They're both versions of the same story. They're both accurate, but they may be versions of that story. If you want to unmute yourself and ask any follow-ups, please feel free to do that. Melissa, what?
Yeah, I've got some thoughts on this, and I'm going to kind of put my PR hat, my public relations hat on this a bit, and refer us back to Audrey's story. So if I'm at SRAM and I'm in the communications department, and I'm thinking, okay, we've got this young woman who's a rising star and she's on our diversity council. How do I want to share this story? Well, of course, I would want to get it in front of the active mobility world in SLO County, just as it is, right? But then you probably notice that there's some other things. So if you think of your story, you think of yourself as a chef, and you think of your story keeping it balanced, and you're thinking of Jim's point about what's my goal with this. So then as a communications person, I would say, well, we've got a great story here about the vintage Royaka ride, which is world famous. And they have the first women who've ever done one of the stops to do all the, and all the vocabulary is going out of my head right now, but you know what I mean, that they were there to help the repairs. And so I would more heavily lean on that. And when we were working on her story, I said, write down all of the geeky specific, really bike language about the tires. And I said, why didn't you change the tires earlier? And she had a really great response, which she didn't want to get rid of those tires. They were really cool. So I said, keep that in your little story folder for things that you can bring out. It could be, there could be a women in bike panel for, like, let's say People for Bikes, for example. And I would pitch Audrey as a rising star in diversifying the bike industry as an expert. And for the expert, if I was going to be talking to the People for Bikes, I might say, well, bring out all the wonkiness, bring out all the vocabulary that proves that you know that world. If I'm talking to Bicycling Magazine, if I was talking to Inc. Magazine about women empowerment. So and you, as an advocate, you do exactly the same thing that Jim was talking about. For each place that you've got your story, you emphasize something a little bit different with the vocabulary and things like that, but you always keep that balance of doing this. And this can get tough when I just want to put a little pin in this one. If you are a survivor of something, if you are a victim of something, it takes a lot of work to get to a place where you can really tell your story in an effective way, because you've got to go through the grief process. So if you know people if this is you, or if you know people that have had this, just have a lot of patience with yourself and recognize that you got to take your time to be ready to tell the story in the way that other people can actually take it in a way that will be effective, if that makes. And then I think we have a couple of questions there.
We do. I wanted to make sure, Meg, first of all, did you have any follow-ups to what we answered, how we responded to your question?
No, I don't. And I appreciate your response. That shed a lot of light on, kind of a direction to take with this. So I really appreciate it.
Now that you have this model in your head of what makes an effective story and what are all the ways you can tell it, now you can think more broadly about who else's story would be valuable, why would it be valuable, how will they tell it. So you have a lot of options. There isn't, and for everybody else, there isn't sort of one answer that works for all of you in all of your capacities. I think the overarching message here is keep an eye on your goal and figure out who your audience is for achieving that goal. That's going to be the way that you find the stories that are the most effective for you. We have a couple questions from Gary. Gary asks, is research best by using the internet, asking other people or other around your audience individual, some other pre-storytelling data gathering. Would one wish an interview before actually making a storytelling adventure? I would say, in response to that, Gary, do your homework however you can do it. You know, I was the executive director of Sacramento Area Bicycle Advocates, which is the regional advocacy organization, Sacramento's answer to Bike Slow, and the in our city in Sacramento, city council members have staff. And so I made sure I knew all of the chiefs of staff of each of the council members, and I would grab coffee regularly with each of them. And that's how I got to know them. If I could do it, I would just have a meeting with the council member to get to know them, maybe just to introduce myself, chat them up about something. Their time is going to be valuable and limited, so you don't want to waste their time just socializing. But I think the point is, yes, you want to do some interviewing if you can do it. You might ask the council member, where do you stand on the county bicycle master plan? You might ask your allies, what do you know about where this person stands? You're probably going to know whether they own a business, where they live, are they parents? I think everything that you've suggested is valuable for getting the intelligence that you need to kind of figure out what makes this person tick, so that when you do come to them with a story, the story is going to touch them as much as you can hope to do.
I think we have another story, another question that looks really interesting that I think, Gary, if you want to follow up with Jim and I for more on that, we'd love to talk to you about it. But I think Jim handled that really well, and I want to make sure we get as many questions answered as we can in our time.
Sure. We have a question from Shailene about the minimum or maximum length of a story. Again, it depends on what you're doing. If you have, you might only have 2 minutes before your city council. At least that was the time limit for giving public testimony at the Sacramento City Council. So I boiled my story, whatever I had to get across, I boiled it down to the right number of words. Typically, humans seem to speak about 100 to 150 words a minute. So one way to do this is write your story out, check your word length, and then start practicing it and timing it yourself. So if you only have 2 minutes, make sure you really land that 2 minutes. On the other hand, the Rancho Cordova City Council, 12 miles east of downtown, doesn't have time limits. I found myself as the only audience member in a hearing, and they were talking about some bike stuff, and I was so great because I popped up. I had a 15-minute conversation with the city council. I've never had that before. So it really depends on the context. For example, if you're going to post a story on the website, it can be a nice long story, right? Because you're not limited by space or time when you post a story on a website. But when you tell it, it might have to be very, very brief. So again, that's situational. Shailene, if you have specific examples for us that you want to chat with Melissa and me about offline, we'd be happy to kind of troubleshoot that for you. We have a question from Keith. I'd love to hear examples of stories successfully integrating audience participation to deliver the intended message. I think one example of this, I'm thinking about Meg and your experience going to the PTA of the neighborhood elementary school to talk to them about the need for the off-street walking and biking path. I mean, that's a great opportunity to give your story and then ask the audience, has anybody had a similar experience? What's your experience of traveling on this street? In that situation, everybody in that room has traveled that stretch of street because they all live in the community, and they've either driven down it and been nervous about people walking or biking on the shoulder, or they have walked or biked on the shoulder, or their kids have, or their neighbor has. Everybody has a personal experience. So that can be a great way to, one, to kind of identify stories that you might want to follow up on. You know, again, kind of put your talent scout hat on. If you hear a story that's particularly compelling, you might want to follow up afterwards and do that. But I think the point that Keith is making is really valuable in about engaging your audience, not only by the story that you tell, but by creating space for them to share their stories. You know, the point I made earlier about ideally everybody has a chance to tell their story. There are going to be some situations where that's literally true, and so you want to do that. Again, you're raising the level of kind of engagement and empathy and motivation. So you really start to get a little more of a group think about that, and sometimes that can be very, very helpful.
So Gary has a great question to kind of follow up, because we're just at time right now. So I think we're going to end this with this question, and then any questions that any of you have that you think of afterwards that you don't have answered for yourself in the information we share with you on Monday, please follow up with us in an email, and we'll be happy to go back and forth with you about that. But I'd like to take a gander at this one. So Gary asks, how does one need to best present with memorized stories, or how bad will reading it come across? And I would say it really depends on the kind of presentation that you're giving. And it's really a good idea, as somebody who's an advocate, to have 3 to 5 stories in your back pocket, 2 to 3 minute stories in your back pocket as a team, as a strategy, to say, hey, these are the ones we bring out for these different situations. You're not going to have them memorized right away. And I would say do write them down, because when you go to give a testimony, you're going to be nervous, whether it's in front of a city council, or gosh, if you had to give one in the courtroom. And you know, only if you're going to give like a TEDx talk or something like that do you really have to have it completely memorized. But by practicing the story, what you will start doing is having more interesting inflection in the story. You'll have better pacing and tone, so that people will understand what you're saying better. And what I want people to understand is that, and some of you are Toastmasters like David Figueroa, so you already know this, but think about when you were in a play, or you watched friends of yours in a play, you really memorized stuff, and then they can be impromptu, right? So if you really know your story inside and out, and you go to some kind of fundraiser, you go to some kind of event, and the person they were supposed to have to speak isn't available, or they're late, and they say, Gary, we want you to get up and tell that fabulous story of yours. And you're like, I didn't bring my notes. If you start taking every opportunity you can have to share your story, write your story out, kind of play with it, 6 months, a couple years later, you're going to be really masterful at telling that story.
I got invited to give a TEDx talk about bicycling and community in Sacramento. And I realized quickly this would be the longest I ever had to talk in front of an audience. They gave me 8 minutes, and they made very, very clear to me that they would pull out the hook at 8 minutes if I went over. And so I was very nervous about this. So they had me start by writing down my story. I had a mentor I worked with. He read the story, gave me a little feedback. And once we were kind of settled on the story, and then I started practicing delivering it in 8 minutes. And I read it from the document for 8, and then took out whatever I needed to take out to get to 8 minutes. And then I put my headphones in so people didn't think I was a crazy person, but I went for a walk in my neighborhood, and I must have recited that story 30 or 40 times, and timed myself with my phone every time to make sure that I could land at 8 minutes, and also that I had every word in my head. So it was kind of a test for myself. And what was surprising to me is I'd also never been videotaped and recorded doing something like that. And when I finally saw the recording, not only did I hit 8 minutes, I didn't sound like a robot. Like that was my big concern, is that I was going to memorize this thing and then sound like I was reading it. And the fact was, I didn't sound like that. I actually sounded conversational. That's an extreme example of being prepared so that you can come across naturally and convincingly. So it's definitely worth, I would say, writing it down and practicing it. And I think with that, we are a little over time. Thank you for all of your attention today. Melissa, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions here that I'm going to actually go and that we will answer in an email to you guys directly today. And David, if you would unmute yourself, you have an invitation to people who have stories they want to work on.
Yeah, well, thanks, Melissa, and thank you, Jim, and thanks for everybody who's on board. In fact, I've got two hats, I guess, right now. I mainly have the hat of being in the firm DCR Design, and we're working together with Pedalove on this project for SLOCOG. But I'll take that hat off and put my SLO Toastmasters Club 83 hat on, and just let you know quickly that we oftentimes help people who want to practice speeches who aren't in our club at all, but they need some type of forum where they can practice an upcoming presentation and so forth. We have probably about 30 or 40% of our members right now are students. They often practice their presentations that they're going to give in their studios or other things for them. And we've helped the TEDx speakers practice their speeches and so forth. So it's something we really like to do. Of course, we have programmed meetings. Any of you who have participated in Toastmasters know they're very strict, but we try to loosen things up, and especially if we have the opportunity to help anybody practice their speeches. So I will just try to drop in the club website there so everybody can see it, and I'll leave it there and turn it back over to Melissa.
And I'm going to pick this up, David, so that I can share this in the email newsletter if I can figure out how to do that. And we have a couple other questions that, Helen, you've asked a very deep question about for victims of serious crashes, how the best way to update your story over time. So I'm going to actually take that question with Jim, and we're going to answer that in our follow-up newsletter to everybody, because I really want to take the time, because that's a really great question. And then very quickly, to leave us off, Gary asked, do you have a library of recorded stories to share? And I would say that I will also share more stories with everybody in the email newsletter probably on Monday, but I would highly recommend that you take a look at Pedalove, our actual website, because we have some good stories there that you can look at. But I would look at the TED.com website and TED stories on YouTube, because the TED people do a fantastic job. And you're going to see stories that are from 8 to 18 minutes. And that's a great way to learn how to become a better storyteller as well.
I would add to that, the Moth is another really excellent resource. These are not stories that necessarily relate to transportation or maybe even to your lives at all, but it's a really great opportunity to kind of start to absorb what makes a story engaging, what about the teller makes the story engaging. The Moth also, if you listen to their podcast or their broadcast on public radio, they include beginner storytellers as well as very accomplished people. And you can hear some differences between people who are just starting out crafting their story and telling it compared to people who are very, very accomplished in front of a microphone. But it's a great way to absorb it. I also had a chance to go to a TEDx, or a Moth presentation in San Francisco last year. Absolutely fantastic. If you ever have a chance to see their live show, absolutely do it. There's just such a different energy in the room when you're hearing people actually doing it live. So lots of good examples there. I think
in ending today, we want to let you know what's coming next. This is the second of the 2 workshops that we shared with everybody. And we want to thank John Denunzio very much for wanting us to host these workshops on behalf of SLOCOG. So thank you, John. We really, and David and DCR for making it possible for Petal Love to be a part of this. This, I have to tell you guys, we've seen previews of the report and David and his team are making it gorgeous. It is really something special. So the next thing that's going to be coming up is that we are going to have, you'll get more information from us. We'll be sharing more information with you. We'll be sharing email newsletters, again, to keep you updated on the fact that we're going to have a live storytelling jam. We hope that it's going to be around Earth Day, right, John? In April. So keep reading those email newsletters that I send out because that'll have the most information. And Gary, I promise to keep sending you really cool little short videos of storytellers that I love to give you examples. So that's it from us for now, right?
Thank you for your time
everybody
today.
so
Really
much.
valuable.
Had such a good
Appreciate it.
time with you all. Have a beautiful rest of your day.